Isn't this wonderful? My goodness. Well, thank you for coming. This is kind of a nice way to spend a holiday season afternoon, and many of you I know have been here the last time, and some of you have not seen me before. So for those of you that have not seen me, I'm Dan Ruminski, and for the last 8 years I've been doing stories about Cleveland history. We've done over 600 presentations in front of about 40,000 people now. And my goal was to make you prouder of Cleveland through this magnificent history. You know, when I started out 8 years ago, Cleveland wasn't on this wonderful upswing. It was pretty negative. All our sports teams were in the tank, not only the Browns, but the Indians and the Cavaliers. So Clevelanders were hungry to be proud of their city, and this history seemed to fit the bill, and I was very blessed to come along at the right time. Again, those of you that have not seen me, you may have some interest in my height. That's generally a question. I am 6'6" and holding. I thought surely that was enough. And as some of you know, I did play basketball at John Carroll University, and then I played professionally for the United States Army for 1 year. So basketball has been a big part of my life. Yes?
We have a son-in-law who's tall, but didn't play basketball. We gave him a sweatshirt which said, "No, do you play miniature golf?"
Very, very good. You've got to think about that a little bit. But quite nice. And I realized, of course, being so tall, and you're sitting down there, that if I stood during the performance, you might be a little uncomfortable. So Carnegie has supplied me with this wonderful chair, and that's my vision of a storyteller, sitting in a wonderful chair with a wonderful fireplace, and tell you, hopefully, an interesting and entertaining story. If I said to you, you know, Cleveland, Ohio, the greatest, wealthiest city in all the world, some of you may ask, Dan, what Cleveland are you talking about? And I'm talking about Cleveland, 1885, the grandest, wealthiest city in all the world. And what made it wealthy is a statistic that's really, even for me, hard to get your arms around. And that was that Cleveland contained over 1/2 of the world's millionaires, all living in Cleveland at the same time. I mean, that's impossible today. You try to put 1/2 of the world's billionaires in a city. But I think we'd all agree, if you were capable of doing that, we'd have a vibrant, fully employed cultural city, the best of the best. That was our Cleveland, Ohio, 1885. We had the grandest avenue in all the world called Euclid Avenue, Millionaires Row. And if you want to have fun sometimes, drive from Public Square out to the clinic, East 105th Street, and try to visualize mansion after mansion after mansion. Some 250 homes. Some as big as 50,000 square feet. One of them, the Andrews Mansion, had over 100 servants to service the mansion. And it was on 6 acres on the corner of Euclid and East 30th. If you go by there today, say hello to Channel 5. That's their location. But when you see the picture of the beautiful grounds, it's hard to imagine what this Millionaires Row was all about. We basically sometimes get questioned, who called Euclid Avenue the grandest, most beautiful avenue? And as a history teacher, I was surprised to read that it was Mark Twain called our Euclid Avenue the grandest, most beautiful. And you might ask, well, how did Mark Twain know? Well, he lived with a family that you might know called Severance. And the Severances were 3 brothers, each had mansions on the row. And Twain lived with them for a while and lived with others on the row. And not only lived with them, but he traveled with the Severances all over the world. So he saw all the other great avenues, whether it was in London or Paris or Moscow. He concluded our Euclid Avenue, the grandest, most beautiful avenue in all the world. So you can imagine having the wealthiest city, the grandest avenue, what this Cleveland was all about. There was an event on the avenue that lasted for 30 years, and most people have forgotten about it, called the Euclid Avenue Sleigh Races. And it went from 1875 to 1905, obviously before automobiles. And one of the things you have to keep in mind is that the people on Euclid Avenue were like celebrities. They were world-renowned personalities. Rockefeller, Mather, Hanna, known throughout the world. And back then, we did not have sports celebrities, so we didn't have movie stars. And the public is always hungry for heroes, and so the people on Euclid Avenue were their heroes. And oftentimes Rockefeller, just going to church, would have hundreds of people lined up just to see him go from East 30th down to his church on East 12th Street. They wanted to feel and touch and look because he was world-renowned. The sleigh races involved all these players, and they raced and bet on each other. They raced from East 40th down to East 9th Street. And as you might envision, thousands of people lined up every afternoon, 6 weeks, every winter, to see their heroes at play. It was quite magnificent. And I'm sure there was betting going on, and afterwards they would go to parties and make merry and have drinks and so on and so forth. It was very festive. And Euclid Avenue was unique because the churches were mixed right in with the avenue. So it was a residential avenue with many, many churches mixed in. And on Sunday, you can imagine, it was a lot of hustle and bustle and marvelous, marvelous things. After reading all this, I wondered, what made Cleveland really great? You know, how does greatness start? And I started pondering this, and I'll come up with some examples. But one of which is we look at Cleveland's theater today, and I think we're all in agreement that we're probably number 2, maybe number 1 in the country as far as our theater district. And I go to the theater, and I enjoy every minute of it. I look at the theater district and try to visualize that was all residential mansions through that area. And we had theater that started well before this date, but about 1875, there was a vision to build a grand opera house on the corner of Euclid and East 4th Street. You would know today as Pickwick and Folly, the restaurant, if you've been there. And I think they have some history there. And this was going to be a grand opera house, all marble, all velvet red seats, a 30-foot chandelier, and just the best of the best in the country. And yet the local paper, the Plain Dealer, was mocking the project. They said it would never be successful. And you might wonder, why would they do this? Why would they mock this wonderful project and this cultural advance in Cleveland? Well, they said it will never be successful because it's too far out in the country. East 4th and Euclid. Cleveland was plotted to go west. Most of Cleveland went from Public Square west at the time until Euclid Avenue started bringing the population east along with Superior Avenue. So that was their grounds. But in spite of that, it was very successful, and many famous people appeared there. You may recognize a couple of them. From our generation, Rita Hayworth. Her grandfather appeared at the East 4th Opera House. And a fellow by the name of Barrymore, the entire Barrymore family, Drew Barrymore, still around today, appeared at the East 4th Opera House. John Barrymore also appeared at the old Cleveland Playhouse, which many of you may have belonged to, and it's good old days, which is located next to the Cleveland Clinic before they moved downtown. I used to love those little theaters and the restaurant and all that went into going to the theater. And Barrymore was in a play there in the 1920s called Bards of Richard. And that play may not be recognizable to you instantly, but there's a famous line in that play that you may remember from high school, from your history classes. It's when King Richard lost his horse in battle, and he holds up his sword and he said, my kingdom for a horse." So closes the play, a very famous line. It struck me as I thought about that line, King Richard, although fictitious, was, you know, one of the wealthiest people in all the world. Had everything in his beck and call. Anything that he wanted, he had. And yet, in that moment of time, he was willing to give it all up for a horse. And it strikes me that this is financial planning to a degree. There are no totally knowns. We all, at a moment of time, have to make some adjustments. And indeed, King Richard had to make a big adjustment. Give it all up for a horse. Now, John Barrymore is about to deliver the line. And everybody is anticipating with great pleasure to hear him deliver this wonderful, wonderful line, which closes out the play. And it was in the Drury Theater, which is a small little theater at the Playhouse, and the acoustics are absolutely perfect. And as Barrymore's about to deliver his line, a big fella in the front row lets out a big belch. Huge belch. Everybody in the theater knew it, and they started laughing hysterically. They could not control themselves. And you could imagine Barrymore in full costume with his sword raised, ready to deliver the line, and he's lost the entire audience. And being the professional that he is, he waited, and it seemed like forever before the audience quieted down. And then finally, when he regained control, he decided to do something different. He didn't say, my kingdom for a horse. He said, get a saddle for that horse's ass. Now, I admired the line, but I admired the creativity. The fact is that I've given a number of speeches, and if you've spoken in public or held meetings, not everything goes according to plan. I looked down one day and I had 2 different socks on. And so you have to adjust. You have to make accommodation. And Barrymore did the best of the best. By the way, he got the longest standing ovation of his entire career. Now, the theater was started by the Durys, and I talked to Remington Dury, who was Francis Dury's great-grandson. And his mother was at that performance. She was a thespian, so we had an eyewitness account. But if you read about Barrymore, it's in a book about him, here in little old Cleveland, Ohio. One of the things that struck me, as I mentioned, is how does greatness start? I mean, all things have a beginning and a middle and an end for the most part, but Cleveland's greatness started through a series of little events that made it great. And one of the smallest involved a little candy. And surely you could ask Dan, how could any greatness lead from a little candy? Well, this wasn't any little candy. By the way, you would know it well. It has a hole in the middle called Lifesaver. But most people are unaware that it was invented here in Cleveland, Ohio, by a fellow by the name of Clarence Crane. And Clarence started out in Garrettsville, Ohio, migrated to Chagrin Falls, where I live, and wound up in Cleveland with a candy store. And he probably realized that at intermission at the Opera House and other theaters, they would serve chocolate. And in the summer, chocolate was a messy affair, especially for the women. It was all melting. And possibly he had thought it was a better idea that we could serve hard candy and kind of eliminate that uncomfortableness. He also, and folklore suggests, he put the hole in the middle. Obviously, it resembles Lifesaver. But the fact is that if a child swallowed the candy, they could still breathe. Now, that's folklore. We don't know absolutely, but it's suggested. And so we have an engineered candy, more or less. And Clarence was enjoying great success. And a fellow by the name of Ed Noble in New York heard about this. And Ed Noble was in the pre-internet business. And I bet you've never heard of the pre-internet. I know when I talk to the millennials, they surely have never heard of the pre-internet. Well, the pre-internet was postcards, by the way. Millions and millions of postcards throughout the world were distributed. And they'd have a famous picture on the front, many of them mansions on Euclid Avenue. Rockefeller's mansion was the most famous, and then advertising on the back. And that's how people as far away as Moscow knew about Euclid Avenue, and they sent people here to paint pictures of the mansions to put on the postcards. Much like the internet does today. It kept us informed worldwide. And so Ed came to Cleveland to sell Clarence some advertising, to advertise his candy on a postcard. And he made one big mistake. He tasted the candy. And he loved it so much, he bought the company for $3,900. Now, don't feel bad for Clarence, because back then you could buy a home for $3,900. He thought it was a fair deal. But Ed wasn't done. He took the Lifesaver brand back to New York. And he built it into a worldwide endeavor. Lifesaver's around today over 100 years. This was 1909. So over 100 years, one of the top 10 brands in all the world. Lifesaver, a little candy with a hole in the middle. But Ed was a great businessman, and he saved, through the Great Depression, over $30 million. A remarkable feat from a little candy with a hole in the middle. And he wasn't done. He wanted to buy another little company. And this was a company that probably you and I were exposed to in some fashion this week here in Cleveland, and never realized that its origination was from a little candy with a hole in the middle. For you see, the little company he bought was ABC, American Broadcasting Company. So maybe you see the point of my story. This is how greatness begins. And if you took that story and combined it with 1,000 other stories, you have this great Cleveland, Ohio, 1885, where over half the world's millionaires came here. Now, I wondered, as a parent, and I have 4 of those little rascals, what was parenting like on Euclid Avenue? You had children raised in the lap of luxury. They had everything at their beck and call. Private schools. Amos Stone, who was a railroad builder, his daughter was a Mather, Flora Stone Mather. He didn't like the school she was going to. So he bought property across the street and he built her a school. This was the power and the wealth. They built magnificent churches like the Old Stone Church and Trinity Cathedral, and they paid for it. They traveled throughout Europe. We go shopping maybe downtown, or maybe we go to the suburb. It's a big deal. Or maybe we go to New York. These people went to Europe to do their shopping. And this was once a year or more to buy their clothes. And this is what wealth did for them. So children with everything at their beck and call, raised in this wealth, how do you make them responsible? How do you make them independent? How do you motivate them? And one of the stories I found involves my favorite family, and it involves the White family. And if you recognize that name, Thomas Howard White was the founder of the White Sewing Machine Company. And I think every family, if we search, has a White sewing machine somewhere in a closet buried. We've all been exposed to the White sewing machines. And one of the things that was unique about it, it was always in a beautiful piece of furniture. If you remember, the sewing machine folded out of this beautiful piece of furniture. And that was by design. It wasn't by accident. The furniture would have fit in any home, any decor. And the reason for it is that the Whites did not want the lady of the house to have to move the sewing machine to do her sewing. Therefore, she could place it and sew anywhere she wanted. And the sewing machine would fold back in and you would never know the difference. Marvelous design, what they thought about. Thomas Howard, the founder of the White Sewing Machine Company, was raised in New England. His parents were in manufacturing, and he indeed wanted to be a manufacturer. And to go into business for himself, he knew he needed to save somewhere around $300. Now, he was making $25 a week working for his parents, and he had some part-time jobs, but even at that, you could imagine the amount of time it would take to save $300. But over time, he did it, and now he's ready to go into business. And he remembered he'd forgotten an important fact. He realized, excuse me, at that time he had to save another $300. And you may ask, well, Dan, you just contradicted yourself. You said he needed $300 to go into business. He's got that. What does he need the other $300 for? Well, there was a grand New England tradition, steeped in their religion, I believe, which said that before the children, in particular the sons, left home, they had to pay back their parents for all the wonderful things they did for them. Thus, the extra $300. Now, as I said, I have 4 of those little rascals.
I like that idea.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And when I read this, I called them all in. And I explained to them what I had discovered. And no check was forthcoming. And so I wrote a book, and I put the story in the book, and I gave them each a copy of the book, and I signed it, and I highlighted the story. No check. So about 3 months ago, my youngest son, Danny, was at one of my talks. And he arranges some of the talks for me, and I had told the story again, which he knew so well, and he raised his hand politely, and he said, Dad, may I say something? And we had a couple hundred people, and I said, oh, yeah, Danny, by all means. He said, well, you're going to be waiting a long time. I said, oh, okay. That's all you had to say? He said, yes, sir, and he sat back down. But I think you get the gist of the story in terms of Thomas Howard was raised that way, so he carried it over into his family. He came to Cleveland and started a sewing machine factory. Was never number 1 in the world. He was number 2 behind Singer. But they were gigantic, and you would find them in all the Sears Roebuck stores. Eventually, it became White Consolidated. And he lived on Public Square for a while, and if you can envision, if you go to the terminal, envision 500 buildings in that area. There were houses, churches, cemeteries, and commercial buildings. All had to be moved or removed or torn down before the building of the terminal in the late 1920s. Thomas Howard, as he enjoyed success, wanted a mansion on Euclid Avenue, so he built out in the country, Euclid and about East 72nd Street. The mansion is no longer there, but you can drive through and have a Big Mac. on that site, as it's a McDonald's restaurant today. That restaurant right down the street from the Cleveland Clinic. If you want to have some fun sometimes, if you're around the clinic, and I said that the mansions were on very large lots, walk or drive from Euclid to Carnegie. It's quite a distance. And that was the depth of the lots on Euclid Avenue. Now keep in mind that on Euclid we still had horses and so on. So they needed land for the horses. And the barns or the coach houses would be on Carnegie and the mansions would be on Euclid. Well, Thomas Howard came to Cleveland, and he was a wonderful man based on how he was raised. He was kind of a Renaissance man. He was a man that many of you may recognize. You have certain people that when they speak, you listen intently because you know they're not going to waste any words. And you know that every word they're going to say is very well thought out. And you also know that that person has a very definitive philosophy. And indeed, that was Thomas Howard. He believed in religion. He believed in charity. He believed in serving one's government, so he was he was on the city council for a number of years. But the thing that he believed in most was one's reputation. You don't do anything to tarnish one's reputation. Now, once you tarnish it, you can try to repair it. But the analogy is much like Humpty Dumpty. You can put all the pieces together, but you still have cracks, no matter what you do. And so he said, you guard your reputation. You don't do anything to tarnish it. You keep it totally intact. Thomas Howard had 7 children. He was quite busy. He had 4 boys and 3 girls. And they all were successful. 3 of the boys, along with him, founded the White Motor Company. They ellipsed their father, and that was the whole point. They didn't take their trust funds. They went to work, and they built a marvelous company. We go back a number of years before the turn of the century, and he had a youngest son by the name of Walter. You would know Walter's great estate as Hawken High School today. That was the Circle W, Walter White's magnificent estate. And Walter was the youngest of 4 boys, and we have an instant one day where he's watching his 3 older brothers play with their toy boats in a pond on the property. And Walter is the youngest, probably slightly spoiled. Obviously, as I said, I had 4 children, and if you're like me and you have multiple children, by the time the last one comes along, you're exhausted. And they get a little spoiled because you don't have the energy. And the older ones always come up and say, you know, Dad, when I was his age, I couldn't get away with that. And I'd say, go away. Mom and I are tired. We want to get you through school, and they want you to move out and call us once in a while, but we want to relax. And we'll get together for Christmas and the holidays. So this was Walter, a little spoiled, and realizing he doesn't have a boat. Now, Walter was very diplomatic, even at 8 years old. By the way, he was a genius eventually. And he thought this out, and he said, well, if I go and just say, Father, have you thought about buying me a boat? Listen to the terminology from an 8-year-old. Father, have you thought about buying me a boat? How clever. Now, we said Thomas Howard was incredibly good about conserving verbiage. And in this case, he was excellent. He just said no. And Walter was a little stunned. He didn't anticipate this kind of answer. And he walked away kind of in a huff, but respectfully, as were the times. And after a while, we don't know how long, could have been a couple hours, could have been a couple days, but he came back and he reapproached his father. And he said, Father, since you're not going to buy me a boat, I'm going to build my own boat. Now, if you're a parent trying to teach self-reliance, isn't that a magnificent answer? That's the very thing you're looking for. But to Thomas Howard's credit, as a parent, he went one step further. He said, son, since you're going to build your own boat, I'm going to buy you a wonderful set of tools. I'm in love with that. I think it represents parenting at its finest level. And as I said, little Walter eventually becomes a genius. He becomes the president of the White Motor Company. But unbeknownst, and sadly in Cleveland history, Walter White, being the genius that he was in transportation, was hired by the Allies in World War I to direct and coordinate all mechanized transportation for the Allied war effort. Nobody knows about this. I happened to get into the White archive at Hawken High School. Nobody had looked at him in 50 years. And lo and behold, I'm reading this and going, I was a history teacher. I knew nothing of this. And you can imagine, whether you're a businessman or not, the chore here. The Army's just going from horse and mule. Now they're going to mechanized. There were no trained mechanics. There were no parts depots. There were no replacement parts. There weren't even drivers. And Walter was hired to coordinate all of this. And he did such a phenomenal job that he got one of the highest awards possible from France after the war. So it's in the history books. And yet we know nothing about this. He always would get irked when he was over in Europe talking to the general. And by the way, the White Motor Company produced 14,000 vehicles for the war effort. And he said, General, I don't see any of my vehicles. What's the problem? I want to see them. And the generals would say, Walter, you're not going to be able to see them. They're the best we have, and they're on the front lines, and you're not going there. You're too valuable. You're going to stay back here. The Whites, everything they touched was perfect. Walter White, in 1921, in front of all of his employees. And we looked out at the audience. He saw a father working next to his son, working next to his son. 3 generations of multiple groups. That's how good the Whites were to their employees. Another thing that Thomas Howard drummed into their heads. Treat your employees fairly. And he looked out at them and he said, you know, our vehicles have to be perfect. Although my name is on the truck, your effort is in every truck and it must be perfect. We want our vehicles to be guaranteed to last 100,000 miles. In other words, a lifetime. Walter White, 1921. General Motors just came out with their 100,000 mile guarantee about 10 years ago. Couldn't we do a little better in 100 years? But that was the Whites. It had to be perfect. And their reputation was on that vehicle. And you can go back to that little story with the little pond and the toy boat as Walter stood there. Walter also got an award from the Canadian military. He was assigned honorary colonelship, which is quite high rank. And as part of that award, he was assigned a piper, a pipe piper for life. A very kind of interesting romantic award. And Walter bought the pipe and bought the outfit, and the piper was available to travel anywhere that Walter wanted, anywhere in the world, to perform. And Walter would pay transportation. A very unique award. And by the way, Walter's piper was Piper Thompson. He was a retired sergeant major. He lost an eye in the war, and he had a glass eye. And when he drank champagne, it glowed and scared all the children. You can imagine. Almost a perfect fit for Walter, I think. And he was my kind of man. He said, I don't drink champagne for the taste, I drink it for the effect. And I thought that was pretty clever. Piper Thompson never once played for Walter during his lifetime, sadly. For you see, Walter wasn't a perfect man. He was addicted to speed. Not the kind that we think of today, not drugs, but speed. He was a race car driver in the early days. And when he retired after almost getting killed, his father moved him into the front office in charge of sales. But he never gave up that yearning for speed. You know where Hawken High School is, probably, most of you. And the White Motor Company was located on East 79th and St. Clair, about 14 to 18 miles away. Walter made that trip from Gates Mills every morning in 10 minutes. If you do the math, he was going 85 miles an hour. And he had a beautiful car, a Stutz Bearcat, which was white, which was the premier sports car of the day. And lo and behold, on a September morning in 1929, he was racing downtown and came to the intersection of Green Road and Fairmont. How many of us have gone through that intersection over the years? And it's a complicated intersection, not very obvious. Back then they didn't have stoplights or stop signs. And Walter comes racing through at 85 miles an hour, and he was hit by a Model T. And he wasn't killed instantly. The car was flipped and thrown into a field. He was laying there. A passerby picked him up. He said, take me to Lakeside Hospital. And the passerby, interviewed after the fact, said he admired Walter's grit and his stamina. And he knew he was in awful pain, and he said, please do not tell my family until we know the extent of the injuries. That was his thought. By the way, Walter had 5 young children at the time. And they took him to Lakeside, and the family gathered around, his brothers and his sisters and their wives. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, they gave him a transfusion, and they were very optimistic. An hour later, Walter White lay dead in Lakeside Hospital. He was 53 years of age. The last white to ever be associated to any significance with the White Motor Company. And had Walter lived, they would have done much better, I think, to the Great Depression, but they suffered tremendously. I went down to the county and I actually got a hold of Walter White's papers. What was he worth? That was always fascinating to me when we talk about millionaires back then. What was their net worth? Walter White was worth $5 million in 1929. And most of his worth were in two stocks, the Coca-Cola and the White Motor Company. Now, Coca-Cola was a big customer of the Whites, using their vehicles. So the chairman of Coke was on the board of White, and Walter was on the board of Coke. So it was natural that he had a lot of stock. And Mrs. White had to come up with about $300,000 for inheritance taxes, and the attorneys went to her and they said, what shall we sell off? Coca-Cola or White Motor? And out of loyalty, she sold off the White Motor. And, of course, or sold off the Coca-Cola, I'm sorry, yes, out of loyalty. Talk about one of those little errors, you know. And years later, of course, the White Motor stock tanked very quickly, and she was fond of saying that the bill collectors are 2 steps behind me. She did stay on the estate, that died in her late 60s in about 1958. And their children went to Hawken High School, and they arranged for Hawken to buy part of the estate. Hawken High School today has 300 acres of the formerly 1,200 acres that Walter had. He was one of the most phenomenal states in all the country. He had polo players come all the way from Spain to play on his famous polo field, which is now Hawken High School's football field. And it's very near and dear to me because I lived on Sherman Road, which cut through the middle of the estate. So I had 6 acres of the former 1,200 acres. And I was thrilled to look at my property and see what it looked like back at the turn of the century, and so on and so forth. So that was our wonderful Cleveland, Ohio. And one of the things I want to leave you with is that oftentimes when I studied history and we talked about these wonderfully successful people, and so many were known as robber barons. You may recall that term from your history class. And the picture was not kind, to say the least. They did everything they could for business. They took advantage of every possible situation, whether it was human beings or whatever it might be. But they never pointed out the other side. And here in Cleveland, we have most definitely another side. These people, again, in religion, were taught that you could make as much money as you possibly wanted. You could be as successful as you possibly wanted to. But when you were all done, you had an obligation to give back to society in a big fashion. And so when so many of them retired, they did. And we're the recipient. They had great vision. Where do we think that orchestra came from? Where did that wonderful building come from? Where did that magnificent art museum come from? How did we do that? Where did the Cleveland Clinic come from? Where did University Hospital come from? The Cleveland Foundation, the United Way, the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts, the Visiting Nurses Association, the Botanical Gardens, Case, Western Reserve, Hiram College. Where did all that come from? Came from the millionaires on Euclid Avenue. That was the legacy that they left us. And yet we don't give them credit. And we surely don't in history. Rockefeller Park. How many of us enjoy that drive today? Down the Cultural Gardens, a great resurgence. And the beauty of these people were, because they were businessmen and they were visionaries, which made Cleveland so great, they not only donated these things, but they set up trust funds so that they would have longevity. So we're looking at an orchestra over 100 years. We're looking at an art museum over 100 years. You know, the art museum started with private collections. These were all housed on Euclid Avenue that were donated. All the names you know about, Jebba Wade and Mather and Hannah. All these folks. They wanted to do something extraordinary that was lasting. And the way we're going, these things are going to last for another several hundred years. So these people could see into the future, and they made it happen. You may not be aware that we call it Martin Luther King Boulevard today. It was Old Liberty Boulevard, and it used to be lined with oak trees. And on each oak tree there was a plaque of somebody that lost their life in World War I. That's why it was Liberty Boulevard. I'm not a fan of renaming streets. I think something like that should be dedicated forever. Even though I'm a fan of Martin Luther King, he deserves recognition, but that street should have remained Liberty Boulevard. You honored those people forever. But we have a tendency to do that. Just look at the change of names at the clinic and University Hospital. Next guy comes in with a little bigger donor, and all of a sudden the name changes. Seems to me people should be recognized for their efforts forever. And so that's why I'm quite anxious to share this legacy with you that these great millionaires left us. These things that we almost take for granted today and really don't think about their origination. That was the great people on Euclid Avenue, Millionaires Row. You have been an absolute marvelous audience, as you were the last time. Those of you that are new, I welcome you. And some of you may have heard this before, but for those of you that did not, when you go home this afternoon, you may talk among yourselves about what you just heard. And you may talk about me, and that's fine. And many of you, hopefully most of you, truly enjoyed this presentation. And you've maybe learned some things that you otherwise did not know. And for that, I'm very grateful. But I was also a history teacher, and I know that my students didn't enjoy my lessons every day. And so some of you may go home this afternoon and say, well, that was not quite my cup of tea. I didn't get what I expected. And I truly understand that. But it seems to me that if you're going to talk about me, I'm going to go home and have dinner with dear Jane tonight, and rest assured we're going to talk about you. And with that, I thank you very much.